Hi, welcome to CGDive. This is the last part of the Blender to Unreal character workflow, at least for now. In this one, we'll set up our exported character so that it acts as a custom third-person character inside Unreal. If you want to be the first to watch CGDive videos, check out Patreon, Gumroad, and YouTube memberships. Okay, let's continue where we left off last time. We have our character exported using Send to Unreal, and I also have the FBX export. In this case, I'm going to be using the assets that I created with Send to Unreal, but I'm going to leave the FBX export here as well. I'm not sure, but I may add one more chapter to this series about using the physics asset, and I may want to show how to solve some of the problems that are created by the direct FBX export and import. But anyway, before we start to set up the character, let's clean things up. I'm going to delete these meshes that I placed into the scene. And this panel here I won't need, so I'm going to move it over and dock it over here, and then I'm going to switch back to the world outliner. I also want to organize these assets. I don't want to work with this untitled asset folder. So let's go to the content folder, right click and create a new folder, and I'm going to create one called static meshes and one more for the racer character. And so the static meshes, I'm simply going to select by control clicking on them. I'm also going to control click on the material, drag them and move them into the static meshes folder. Choose move here. All the remaining assets I want to move to the racer folder. However, I found that if I just select everything and move it over to the racer folder, the animations lose their connection to the skeleton, which can be fixed, but I want to avoid that. So I'm going to go into the animation folder, select all animations and move them to the untitled assets folder. Now everything is just in one single folder. I'm going to select all assets and move them to the racer folder. Now in the racer folder, I'm going to create a new folder called animations and move the animation assets to that folder. And that should work. In fact, I'm going to save my project here and restart the project. Because this problem that I noticed appeared when I restart the project. So go to File, Save All. And I also want to save the map itself. So go to File, Save Current As, and you can create a new map or just save over this basic map. Now I'm going to restart the project. Okay, let's go into the racer animations and test them. And they work fine, so everything is fine. And now this untitled category folder is all empty, so I'm going to delete it. Now we can start setting up the racer as a third-person character. I'm going to go into the racer folder, right-click and create a new folder and call it Blueprints. And this is where I'll place all of my blueprints, which will actually control how this character behaves in the project. And we need 3 main blueprints to create our own third-person character. First, I'm going to right-click, choose Blueprint class, and create a game mode base. So we are going to have our own game mode. I'm going to call it My Game Mode or whatever you want. Just take note of the name that you choose. Then we need one more blueprint class. This time we need a character. And I'm going to call it BP, which stands for Blueprint Racer Character. Okay. And finally we need an animation blueprint. So right click, animation, animation blueprint. And for the animation blueprint, we need to specify which skeleton it is going to be using. Since I imported this character twice into the same project, we have 2 skeletons. If you only did one import, which is recommended actually, you will probably just have one skeleton. I want to use the skeleton that was exported by Send to Unreal, which is the CH20 skeleton. So I'm going to select it and press OK. I can verify that that's the name of my skeleton in the eraser folder. Here it is. Okay, before we start setting things up, let's just press play and see what happens. And I'm able to fly in this map. So even when you don't have anything set up, Unreal will automatically create a special default game mode in which you can just fly around in the map. I pressed escape to go out of play mode. However, I don't want to use this default mode, I want to use my own game mode. So I'm going to go to the world settings here, and under game mode override, instead of none, I'm going to click and choose my game mode. I'm also going to set my default pawn class to the BP Racer character, because I want it to be my playable character in this map. Now if I press play, I am completely unable to move. And that is because we set our new character as a playable character, but we haven't actually set up the behavior that we need. So press escape, and let's go into the blueprints folder and start setting things up. The first thing that we are going to set up is the racer character, but here I noticed that I forgot to name the animation blueprint. So let's click on it and name it BP Racer Animations. Okay, so we have these two blueprints, and how to set them up and how they connect with each other can be a little bit complicated, and it will take some time to get used to. But in a nutshell, the character blueprint will define what the character will look like and what it can actually do in the game. And the animation blueprint defines which animation will be played when the character does something. And again, this may seem a little bit complex at first, but if you do it 5 or so times, it will start to become more clear. Okay, I'm going to quickly set up what a character will look like. So I'm going to double click on the racer character blueprint. And when it opens, I'm going to dock it next to my other main window so that I can quickly switch between them. The character blueprint has some things already set up for us. So first we have a mesh component. I'm going to select it, and here I can choose which skeletal mesh will be used for this character. And I'm going to go with my CH20 character. Okay, here it is, and I need to align it with the capsule. So I'm going to move it down a little bit, and then press E for rotation, and rotate it 90 degrees until it aligns with this forward arrow, so that I know that my character is looking forward. Next, I'm going to select the capsule and click Add Component and scroll down and find the spring arm. And the spring arm is a component that helps us attach a camera to a character. So I'll press W and move it up a little bit. And then with this spring arm selected, I'm going to add another component and look for camera and add it. Because I had the spring arm component selected, the camera automatically became the child of this spring arm. I can now move my camera a little bit. Now I'm going to compile, and I can press play here. And here we have our character. It's already being used in the map, but I cannot do anything with it. So press escape. So now we want to start setting up how this character behaves. And the first thing that we need to do is to define the controls that are going to move this character. Okay, the first important step is to define the inputs that this character can take, and then we'll define how the character reacts to these inputs. By inputs, I mean pressing a key on the keyboard or on a controller or on the mouse. So let's go into a project settings. If you don't have this window, go to Edit, Project Settings, and then go to Input. And in here, we need to define our bindings. So we'll start with some axis mappings. I'm going to create one new axis mapping, expand it, and call it Move Forward. And I want to move forward with the W keyboard key. So I'm going to type W and scroll down and find the keyboard W key. And now I'm going to press this plus button. This gives us one more value, and I'm going to set it to keyboard S. And the scale I'm going to set to -1. And that way, pressing W will move the character forward, and pressing S will move it backwards. Create one more axis mapping, call it Move Right. And with the WASD controls, D is right, so choose keyboard D. and create one more value, set it to A, keyboard A, and give it a scale of -1. One more axis mapping, call it look right, and assign it mouse X, and one more, call it look up, and assign mouse Y to it. Okay, these bindings will allow us to move the character in all directions and also look around with the mouse in all directions. If you remember the animations that we created, we also want a character to be able to jump, crouch, run, and we also wanted to test the squash and stretch action. So I'm going to go to action mappings and create a new one. Call it jump. And to it, I'm going to assign the spacebar key. One more crouch. And I'm going to use the left control, or you can add another one and give it, let's say, the C key. So I'll be able to crouch with two different buttons. One more action mapping, call it run. And I'm going to choose the left shift button. So the way I'm going to set the character up is that he'll be walking by default, and then when I press shift, he'll start running. And I'll add one more action mapping, call it stretch, and give it the Q key, for example, or any other key that you like. Okay, these are our bindings. Let's see how we can use them to move our character. I'm going to go back to the racer character and switch to the event graph. And I won't need any of these default nodes that I have here. So I'm going to delete them. And first I'm going to try to make my character move in the map. So I can do that by right-clicking here, looking for move forward. That's the axis mapping that we defined earlier in the project settings input. And I'm going to choose the axis event move forward. Drag out a connection from here and look for add movement input. Okay, and axis value I'll connect to scale value. And from world direction, I'll drag out a connection and look for get actor forward vector. Okay, now if I compile and play, if I press W and S, my character will move forward and backwards, but not sideways, not yet. Press escape and right click again here in the event graph and look for move right. Drag out the connection, add movement input, connect the axis value to scale value, and get actor right vector. Compile, play. Now my character moves forwards, backwards, left, and right. So this is how we set up the physical movement of our character in the map. Obviously, he isn't doing the animation yet. Again, this will be set up in the animation blueprint. So I can select all of these nodes, press C, and that will place them in this frame to indicate that they are related to each other. Namely, they create the movement. So I'm going to call this movement. Okay. Next, I want to create the camera movement. So I'm going to, again, right-click and look for look right. Create a connection, look for yaw, and choose add controller yaw input. And connect the axis value to the value. Compile and play, and now I can look around left and right, and I can also move. Cool, let's also enable the character to look up and down. So right-click, type look up, and choose the axis event look up. Create a connection, search for pitch, add controller pitch input, and connect axis value to value. And now compile and play, and it won't work. And there are two things that we need to fix. First, go to spring arm, select it, and find the use pawn control rotation option and enable it. compile and play, and now I can move the camera up and down, but it moves in the opposite direction that I expect. I know that some people like this behavior, but I don't. So I can fix that by going to project settings, and for the mouse up, instead of scale of 1, I'm going to give it scale of -1. Now if I play, I'll get the look around behavior that I expect. So that's how you set up looking around with the mouse. Select everything, press C, and you can call this frame look around or something like that. Okay, next let's set up the ability of the character to walk and run, meaning that the character will be moving at a certain speed by default, and when we hold down Shift, the character will start moving faster. So let's move the graph to around here, right click and look for event run. And here it is, action events run. And here I'm going to need a reference to the character movement component. I'm going to simply drag it from over here into my graph, drag out the connection and look for set max walk speed. And I want to duplicate this node. The shortcut for that is Ctrl W, and I'll also connect it in the same way. And now I can set things up so that when I press the Shift key, which is this input, when it is pressed, Unreal will set the walk speed to a certain value, and when it is released, it will set it up to another value. We haven't set up these values yet. Let's click on the character movement component and search for walk over here, and you're going to find max walk speed. By the way, don't be confused by the word walk speed. This will also relate to running, so any movement that is on the ground. And we can see that the maximum is 600. So I want my character to be running at the speed of 600. So over here, I'm going to set this value to 600. When Shift is pressed, the character will be moving at a speed of 600. And for the walk, I'm going to set it to 300. So the standard walking speed will be 300. If I now compile and play, you'll see that the character moves quite quickly as before. If I press Shift once and start moving, the character will start moving a little bit slower. And if I press Shift now, it will move faster, and if I release Shift, he'll move slower. But I think that is a little bit hard to understand now, so let's press Escape and set the walk speed to something like 50. Compile and play, and now we see the character moving quite fast. Now I'm going to press Shift once, and now the character will start moving very slowly. And then if I press Shift, it will move quickly again. So it seems that this program that we created here with these nodes kicks in after the first time I press Shift. So this is how we can fix this. I'm going to set this to 300, and then I'm going to go to the character movement component, and I'm going to set the max walk speed to 300. So the default will be 300. Then as soon as I press Shift, it will jump to 600. And when I release Shift, it will be back to 300. So we'll always have the correct behavior. Compile, play, and now the character is moving slowly. And if I press Shift, he starts moving a little bit faster. And that's all about walking and running. Select all nodes, press C, and call it walk run or something like that. Okay, next we are going to set up jumping. Right click, look for jump, and select the action events jump. Setting up a jump is actually very simple. When this input is pressed, I'm going to look for jump and select the jump function. That is a predefined function inside Unreal that I can use. And then when it is released, I will stop jumping. Okay, compile and play. And now if I press spacebar, my character will kind of jump. Okay, so that's all about jumping. Very easy to set up. Next, I also want to crouch, and that can be set up almost as easily. First, I'm going to right click, look for crouch, and get my action event crouch. When pressed, I want the crouch function, and when released, I want the uncrouch function. Again, these are predefined functions inside Unreal. Now I can compile and play and press my Control or C key and nothing will happen. And for one thing, that is because we haven't set up the actual animations yet, but also I'm going to go to the capsule settings here and let's uncheck hidden in game and compile and play again. Now I can see the capsule in my game. If I press Control now for crouching, nothing is happening. What should happen is that the capsule shrinks so that it covers the crouched height of your character. If I select character movement component here and look for crouch, there's this can crouch option. I'm going to check it now, compile and play. And now if I press Control, you'll see that the capsule becomes shorter. Okay, so with that, crouching is set up. So if I go to character movement here and look for jump, there is a checkbox called can jump. If I uncheck it, compile and play, then I won't be able to jump even though I'm pressing spacebar. I'm going to check it again. So that was the main difference between crouching and jumping. Both are predefined in Unreal. It's just that the ability to jump is on by default and crouching is off by default. I'm going to create another frame, call it crouch. And that's almost all for my character blueprint. I'm also going to set up the arm stretch action in here, but I'm going to leave it for later because that's a little bit special. So next we are going to start setting up our animation blueprint. Let's double click to open it. And for me, it was docked next to the other tabs that I have. So that's perfect. And now the animations blueprint has two main areas, the anim graph and the event graph. Generally speaking, in the anim graph, we are going to define our animations and create transitions between them. And in the event graph, we're going to calculate certain variables like the speed of the character. Is he jumping or crouching or doing something else? And these calculations will be used in the anim graph as conditions for playing certain animation. So if the character is moving forward, play the walking animation. If he is in the air, play jump, and so on and so forth. So let's practice, and I think it will make more sense. In the anim graph, I'm going to right click and look for machine and add a new state machine and connect it to the final result. The state machine is where we define our main animations and create transitions between them. So double click to enter it, and from the default entry point, drag out a new connection and create a new state and call it idle. This first state is the default state that the character will enter as soon as the game starts playing, regardless of input from the user and other conditions. So if I double click this state, I can enter it, and here I'll just grab my idle animation from my asset browser, drop it into the graph and connect it to the output. Compile, and you'll see that the character starts playing the idle animation. If I play the actual game now, the character is still not playing the animation. And that is because we haven't told the character blueprint to use the animation blueprint. So if I go back to the character blueprint, select my mesh, under animation there is the anim class field, click on it and choose BP Racer Animations, compile and play the game. And now the character will be playing the idle animation. It is still the only animation that he's playing. So let's see if we can make him walk now. Go back to the animation blueprint, go to the state machine, and from the idle state, hover over this edge of the state and drag out a new connection and add a new state. Call it walk, run. So we're going to handle walking and running in one go. If I double click this state, I can drag out my walk and run animation, but instead of trying to combine them in here, one of the best ways to do this is to use a so-called blend space. So let's delete this, and I'm going to go to my main interface, and I want to create a new blend space. I'm going to go to the animations folder, right click, choose animation, and choose blend space 1D. Okay, not just blend space, but blend space 1D. This is a simple type of blend space that will be perfect for our project. I'm going to choose the CH20 skeleton that I'm using in this project, and I'll name the blend space walk run. Double click to enter it. And here, if the horizontal axis is not expanded, and we want to set the maximum axis value. And I'm going to set it to 600. If you remember, in the character blueprint, character movement, the maximum walk speed is, we set it to 300, but when the character is running, we did set it to 600. And that's why I want the maximum value for this blend space to be 600. This area here is the actual axis, and it goes from 0 to 600, or to whatever value we set in here. Okay? So I want at the speed of 600 my player to be running. So I'm going to take the run action and place it all the way at the end of this axis. And then I'll take the walk and place it in the middle. And now if I click on the green diamond here, you'll see that as I go from walking towards running, my character will slowly transition from walking to running. We can also drag out the walk one more time and place it all the way at the beginning of the axis and change its rate scale to something low like 0.1. And now if I drag the green diamond, I can go from running to walking to slow walking. Okay, let's go back to the animation blueprint, drag out our walk run blend space, and connect it to the output of the walk run state. This is not going to work yet. We need to know the actual speed of the character, and that will drive the walk and run blend space. So to set this up, let's go to the event graph. And the first thing we want to do is drag out a connection from event blueprint update animation and look for is valid. And also connect try get pawn owner to the input object. Okay, I'm not going to try to explain this node here. Using it is good practice. Next, I'm going to create a new variable, call it speed. And by clicking on this icon here, I'm going to make it into a float variable. Drag it into the graph and choose set speed. As I tried to explain earlier, in the event graph, we try to calculate or set the variables, and then in the anim graph, we use or get these variables and use them as conditions that define our animations. So from pawn owner, I'm going to drag out a new connection and look for velocity and choose the get velocity function. This function will actually calculate the speed at which our character is moving. However, it returns a vector. We need a float. So if we drag out a new connection and look for vector length, that will convert the vector into a float. Now I can connect it into my speed variable, and I'm also going to connect up these two nodes so that the whole graph is executed. Now I can compile and play, and now if I move the character, it still won't walk. I have to go to the anim graph, drag out the speed variable and get it, and then connect it into the walk run blend space. Compile and play, and it still won't work. So we have to go back to the state machine, and in the transition between states, there is always a condition. If we double click it, here we can define the condition under which we will switch from idle to walking. So I'm going to drag out the speed variable again and get it. Drag out a connection and type a greater than symbol and choose the float greater than float and connect that to the result. And now what I'm saying is when the speed is greater than 0, then enter the walking state from the idle state. Compile, play, and now if I press W or any of the movement keys, my character can walk and run. However, if I stop pressing anything, you'll see that my character keeps walking very, very slowly. Let's exit and go to the state machine. And the reason that the character didn't go back to the idle state is because there is no transition from walking to idle. We have a transition from idle to walking, but not backwards. So drag out a transition from walk run towards idle and connect it. Double click on the condition, drag out the speed variable and get speed. Drag out a connection, type equals and choose the equal float function and connect it to the result. Compile, play. Now my character will walk and run, and if I stop doing anything, it will go back to idling. Okay, when connecting these states in the state machine, always keep in mind that the character may need to go not just into certain state, but also back to another state. Okay, let's set up jumping next. I'm going to drag out a new connection from the idle state. Add a new state, call it jump, double click it, simply drag out the jump action and connect it. And of course, I'm going to want a connection back to idle. And now, what kind of condition can I use to make the character play the jump animation? We are going to need another variable, and I'm going to call it something like in air, and change it to a Boolean type this time. Drag it out here in the conditions graph, get in air, and connect it to the result. And so when the character is in the air, he'll play the jump animation. Let's go to the event graph, drag out in air, and choose set. Okay, let's drag out another connection from the pawn owner. Search for get movement component. This will allow us to access certain information about the character movement. Drag out a new connection and search for is falling. And now connect the return value to the in-air variable and connect these two as well. Compile and play. And now if I press spacebar, my character will jump and then he'll keep jumping. You probably already understand why. Because we didn't set the conditions for returning to idling. So let's set that. Drag out in air and get it. Drag out a new connection and look for not Boolean and connect it to the final result. Compile and play. Now if I jump, my character will jump and then he'll be back into the idle position. Now if I walk and try to jump, my character won't play the jump animation. And again, you probably start to understand why. That is simply because we haven't established a connection between walking and jumping. So I'm going to drag out one connection from jumping to walking and one from walking to jumping. And the condition will be exactly the same. If the character is in the air, then he'll jump. And if he's not in the air, he'll go back to walking and running or idling. So let's set the condition for going from walking to jumping. Drag out in air and get the variable and connect it to the result. And then in the opposite direction, get the variable, connect it to a not Boolean, and connect it to the result. Compile and play. And now I can jump and go back to idle. I can walk and jump and then keep walking, run and jump, and so on. So jumping is working now as well. So let's go back to our state machine. And now we want to set up a crouching state. I'm going to drag out a connection from the idle state, add a new state and call it crouch. And I'm going to connect it back to the idle state. And I also want to be able to go into crouching while walking or running. So I'm going to create back and forth connection between these two states. I don't really want to go from jumping to crouching, so I'm not going to create a connection between these two. When the character is crouched, he can be idle or he can be walking in the crouched position. So one hassle-free way to create this is to use another blend space. So go back to the main interface and in the animations folder, right click and create another blend space 1D. Choose your skeleton, and I'm going to call it crouch idle walk. And open up the blend space. Now, if I go to my character blueprint and I already have character movement selected and I search for walk, and here I'll find the max walk speed when crouched, and it is set to 300. So for this blend space, I want a maximum access value of 300. I'm going to drag out the crouch idle animation and place it at the beginning of the axis and crouch walk at the end. And so my character will slowly transition from just idling to walking in a crouch position. Go back to the animation blueprint, go into the crouch state, and drag out the crouch, idle, and walk blend space and connect it to the result. And we want this blending to happen again based on the character's speed. So I'm just going to drag out the speed variable that we already have and get speed and connect it into the blend space. And as for the condition for going into the crouch state, we want a way to check if the character is crouching. So I'm going to create a new variable, call it crouching, and it is already set to Boolean, which I want. Now I'm going to go to the event graph, drag it out, and here I want to set it somehow. From the in-air variable, I'm going to drag out a connection and search for cast to racer, and I'm going to choose cast to BP racer character. And then I'm going to connect the pawn owner to the object. I can double click on this connection to create a reroute and position it like that to make the graph easier to understand. Then I'm going to drag out a connection from here and search for is crouched and get the is crouched variable. Okay, I'm going to plug the result into the crouching variable and connect these two nodes. Now back to the state machine, I want to set up all of these connections that I have between crouching and the idle and walk states. So I want to go from idle to walking when crouching is true, so I'll simply connect it to the result. And I want to go back when I'm not crouching, so I'll get the crouching variable, look for not, and connect that into the result. And actually I'm going to select these two nodes and copy them, go back. To go from walking to running, I'm going to paste the nodes, delete the not node, and connect the crouching variable directly to the result. And then in the opposite direction, I'll paste the nodes and connect the not node into the result. Compile, play, and now if I press Ctrl or C, my character is going to crouch and idle. If I hold Ctrl and move my character, he'll start walking in the crouch position. And now we can walk, run, jump, and even crouch. Something that you may notice if you can even see if the capsule is that it doesn't really cover the whole character when it's crouched. Let's go out and go to the racer character blueprint, select character movement, search for crouch, and you'll find the crouch half height value. Right now it's set to 40, which I think means 40% of the actual size. I found that if I set it to around 55, it looks nice. So compile and play and try to crouch, and you'll see that the capsule pretty much covers the whole character. And with that, we set up crouching correctly. We are almost done. I just want to test the special arm stretch animation, which we created earlier. So in the event graph of the racer blueprint, I'm going to right click and look for stretch and choose my stretch action event, which we created at the beginning. Now I'm going to create a new variable in here in the character blueprint and call it stretch. and drag it out, and I want to set it. And I want one more copy of the same variable. So the shortcut for that is Ctrl W. Now when the stretch button is pressed, I want to set it to one state, and when it is released, I want to set it to another state. And since this is a boolean, it can be on or off. So when I press the button, I want this variable to become true. So I'm going to tick this checkbox. And when it is released, I want it to be false. So I'll leave this checkbox unchecked. Compile. Go to the animation blueprint, into the event graph. And now from cast to BP raise a character, which we created earlier, I can access this new variable that I just created. So I'm going to drag out a new connection here and look for stretch. And I'm going to choose get stretch. And here I want to drag out and create a new branch node. Connect crouch into it. And here I want one more variable. I'm going to call it stretching and make it into a float value. Drag it into the graph and I want to set it, and I want 2 copies of it, so I'm going to press Ctrl W. The first one I'm going to set to 1 and the second one I'll leave to 0, and then when stretch is true, meaning when I'm pressing the button that activates this function, I want this stretching variable that I just created to be set to a value of 1, and when it is false, I want it to go back to 0. Okay, now I'll go back to the anim graph, and we are not going to set this stretching action here in the state machine, because I don't want a simple transition between these actions. I want the arm stretch to be able to mix with all of these states that we have here. So I'll go back to the anim graph, pull out a connection here, and look for layered blend per bone, and connect that to the final result. Drag out my stretch animation and connect it to blend pose 0. And this will be blending based on the value of the stretching variable. So drag it out, get stretching, and connect it to the blend weight. Now if I compile and play, I can press Q, which was my button for stretching, and nothing is happening. So we have to go back into the layered blend per bone node, click it, and under details, expand layer setup, create a new element. And here we have to define which part of the rig will be affected. I can set that to root, compile and play. Now if I press Q, my character, the whole character, will play this stretching animation. And by the way, we can see that the stretching is fine. But yeah, if I walk and then press Q, my character will just go to the default position and start stretching. And that's not what I want. So I'm going to go to the skeleton of this character and look at its bones. And this is the arm that is actually stretching. So I'm going to select this DEF upper arm bone, right click and choose copy selected bone names. Go back into my blueprint and I'll paste this name in the bone name field. Compile, play, and now I can walk. And now if I press Q, my character will keep walking while only the arm is kinda stretching. I can also crouch and stretch my arm, jump and stretch. And yeah, this action will kinda blend with all of the other animations that we have. So this whole stretching action is a little bit random, but actually the same principle can be used if you want some sort of attack animation, for example. And so the character is fully set up. Now let's quickly try to finish setting up this test map. I'll go to the main 3D interface. My goal was to create this third-person character completely from scratch, but we're still using this default player start that we got from the basic map, so I'm going to delete it. And now if I press play, I'll just spawn wherever the camera is. So I could go to the actors panel and pull a player start and place it in the map, and now my character will appear there. Another way to do this is to go to your racer blueprints. I'm going to delete the player start and pull out the race a character blueprint. And now if I play, I won't spawn where this character is. So I need to select the character, go to its details, search for pawn in here, and set auto possess player to player 0. And now if I play, I'll appear exactly where this character is in the map. And finally, I may want to create a little test map. I can copy this default floor by holding Alt and clicking on one of the movement arrows. If I change grid snapping to 500, I can snap the new floor tile exactly at the edge of the original one. So I'm going to create a few more the same way. And now I can go to my static meshes, drag them into the map, and arrange them as I want. And now I have a larger map where I can test the character movements. However, if I now try to climb some of these ramps and so on, it won't work. And to fix that really quickly, I'm going to double click my static meshes, search for collision, and for collision complexity, choose use complex collision is simple. And I'm going to do this for all objects. This is not a general recommendation, it's going to be bad for performance, but in this case, it's going to help me set things up quickly. Okay, now if I play, I'll be able to climb the ramps and everything. Another thing that you may want to do to make testing simpler is to go to your light source and set it to movable, and also the skylight, set it to movable. And that way you'll have fully dynamic lighting. That is again not perfect for performance, but that way you can avoid having to bake the lighting every 5 minutes. So it is great for testing your maps. Thank you for watching, and special thanks to my patrons. Please click like and subscribe, and see you in the next video.